Hey, I'm Serena, and I decided to give y'all a quick overview of weighing on the Septober topic, resolved NATO should substantially increase its defense commitments to the Baltic states. I'll be going over a bunch of stock arguments on the topic, how to weigh them, and how to weigh against them. Finally, I put together a weighing master sheet that'll be in the video description, which you can literally just read off en route. Starting with the AF arguments, with the first one about a Russian Baltic invasion. So this is the most stock AF argument, as you probably know. It's about a Russian conventional invasion into the Baltics. Usually the uniqueness here is that Russia is preparing a diversionary war in the near future to divert attention away from like a failing economy, COVID, political opposition, any number of domestic issues. And this war then escalates to World War III, nuclear war, extinction, whatever big impact you want. So the benefits of this argument come from the short link chain, the large and relatively uncontestable impact, and just like the huge amount of literature on it. So let's talk about how to weigh it. First, it's like a really big conflict. That means you can just use scope, magnitude, reversibility, all the generic ones, lives over, the economy, etc. You already know. But another way you can weigh it is that war means a lot of instability. That means that your argument, it probably links into basically every neg retaliation argument. For example, starting a war would be like a really big threat to the Baltics, which means that the Baltics themselves have to redirect funds and attention from addressing other issues like cybersecurity, Syria, counterterrorism, whatever the next terminal impact is. But also, this one's pretty obvious, but war also links into any arguments about the economy on the neg. For example, war will destroy infrastructure and investor confidence. And you can also easily link into the oil shock argument because like during the war, there's a lot of instability, a lot of investor uncertainty, and like supply lines are probably like not the best. So you can very easily link into that oil shock argument on the neg. Finally, if there's a war between the US and Russia or NATO and Russia, that's like the maximum amount of tensions that there could possibly be between two states. That means that Russia's probably not going to be cooperating in any sort of diplomatic agreement or like negotiation. Like New START, for example, they definitely pull out of the Syria peace deal. They probably would not cooperate with the US, and same with the Iran nuclear deal. So any of these neg arguments about diplomacy and provoking Russia can probably be linked into with this AF argument about an invasion. But more importantly, you're probably going to be weighing this invasion AF a lot against the invasion neg. So how do we do that? First, obviously the historical precedent way to weigh it is that when we increased troops in 2017, it prevented an invasion because obviously Russia didn't invade, rather than provoking any sort of Russian military response. But second, you can also say that there have been diversionary wars before, proving that like the link to your Russian invasion has triggered before, but your opponents, which is like troops on the border, probably have never caused Russia to actually militarily invade a country. And finally, you can argue that even if war happens, having troops in the Baltics, which happens through fiat, means that the Baltics can better defend themselves and less people die. That means that it might seem like you're just link weighing the AF war argument over the neg war argument, but really the impacts are slightly different because in the AF war scenario, there are troops in the region protecting the Baltics, while in the neg situation, there isn't. So moving on to the second AF argument, which is NATO collapse leading to allied proliferation. So this is the second most stock AF argument, and it's the idea that reaffirming our commitment to NATO through deploying troops will unite a collapsing alliance. And that's good because without NATO, all our allies would probably proliferate and start a global nuclear arms race. And that usually then impacts the proxy wars, miscalculation, social spending trade-offs, just whatever you typically impact off of for nuclearization. So now let's talk about how to weigh it. First, this is talking about multiple conflicts. So that means your impact scenario probably involves a lot of different locations and a lot of different actors that would warrant scope weighing. You can also probably do similar like magnitude and reversibility weighing as in the previous argument because you're kind of just impacting to like the same argument, which is a conflict, but on a wider scale because they're happening in a lot of different hotspots. Also, allied proliferation probably provokes Russia just as much, if not even more, than increasing troops. If you think about it, like between defensive troops and defensive nuclear weapons, nukes are far more scary to Russia. So that means Russia would probably violate New START and cyber attack nuclear facilities. All that retaliation probably just still happens after like a global nuclear arms race starts. And finally, the impact scenario here is between newly nuclearized states. That means that these states are probably missing like second strike capabilities, ballistic missile defenses, hotlines, diplomatic relations, or just experience with nuclear weapons in general. That means the risk of conflict between them, or like the risk of miscalculation, or something going wrong, is just like way higher than between like the US and Russia, who have had a long history of having nuclear weapons, knowing how to deal with them, engaging in diplomacy, hotlines, all of that stuff. And finally, obviously, you have your link-ins into the economic arguments on the neg through war, but you also have an additional link about diverting funding, because it's very easy to convince judges that nuclear weapons are expensive and thus probably will divert funding from things like social services or counterterrorism or whatever other argument that the neg wants to talk about. So now moving on to the third argument I chose, which is sea mines. So sea mines is a pretty unique argument that I've heard from a number of teams, and although it might seem dumb at first, it's actually decently easily landable. So the argument here is that NATO is pulling out demining operations right now, which is really bad, and also something that would fall under defensive commitments. The most common impact scenario on this one is reducing investor confidence, then hurting trade. But some people also like to impact biodiversity loss by saying that toxins will slowly ooze out of these sea mines and then just pollute the ocean and kill a bunch of fish. So in terms of how to weigh this impact, first, it's not any specific actor choosing to do something. So a lot of the actor incentive scenarios on this topic don't make much sense because it says that Russia will attack or cut off oil or cyber attack, which then leads to deaths, a recession, or extinction. But the thing is, if that's true, then why would Russia do that in the first place? Because those impacts definitely also hurt Russia as well. So this impact disproves the link argument, somewhat decreases the probability of it happening. But on the other hand, there's no one purposely setting off the sea mine, or there's no one purposely leaking toxins into the sea and causing extinction, so the same effect doesn't really exist. Also, the time frame is pretty far into the future of this one, which means that it's very continuous. That means that insofar as sea mines exist, they'll probably always pose a risk to trade, or they'll always keep leaking these toxins into the ocean. On the other hand, a lot of neg arguments like the one-off wars or the retaliation arguments don't really make much sense to happen again and again. For example, if we do increase troops in the Baltics and Russia wants to cut off oil, they're not going to cut off oil indefinitely. A retaliatory oil shock is always just a couple days or a week maybe. So finally, the economic effects of a trade impact also links into other conflict impacts, but probably on a wider scale. For example, economic decline can cause war or instability, which outweighs any hotspot scenarios the neg talks about because you're kind of able to link it on a global scale, but they only link into NATO versus Russia. So moving on to the neg arguments. The first neg argument is obviously, again, the Russian Baltic invasion argument. So this is just the reverse of the Stockist argument. The typical link here, though, is that Russia misinterprets defensive commitments as offensive, or just sees troops as an extension of the US or NATO trying to encircle it, and then they get really, really mad and invade. So the internal link could be a preemptive strike before troops are deployed, or just a normal invasion leading to a gigantic war impact. So moving on to weighing, most of the weighing here is obviously the same as the AFS invasion argument: scope, magnitude, reversibility, you already know. It's also the same with the prereqs to the econ arguments. But you can also outweigh on time frame, because the preemptive strike argument argues that Russia will be so mad that they'll kind of strike these troops before they're even deployed to neutralize the threat. That means that because your argument happens so soon, basically simultaneously with fiat, then any prereqs or link-ins coming off of this argument should be prioritized. But then specifically, let's talk about how to weigh against the AF invasion argument. First, on uniqueness, because Russia hasn't invaded yet, so kind of the only way to risk an invasion or risk a change to the perfectly fine status quo is by voting AF and doing something. The second is on magnitude, because the AF's link is usually that Russia wants a quick and easy invasion to either divert attention away or just to acquire a valuable piece of land. So definitionally, by their link, this war can't cause World War III or extinction or some really big devastating impact, because that would defeat the purpose of invading in the first place. In other words, Russia's not gonna launch a diversionary war that causes World War III or extinction. So if their impact is true, their link probably isn't going to trigger. And if their link triggers, then their impact probably isn't going to manifest. That means that on the other hand, the negs argument is triggered by Russia kind of perceiving an existential threat to their security, which makes it far more likely that they'll escalate to some really big conflict that might risk extinction. So the next neg argument that I chose was the argument about oil shocks. So this argument reuses a pretty common debate impact scenario. It basically says that Russia will be mad that we deployed troops, and then as a result, it'll cut off oil to the Baltics or Europe in retaliation. So the impact here is usually a recession or food price spikes that push people into poverty. So this is one of the few non-conflict impacts, so let's talk about how to weigh it. First, the economy kind of links into pretty much everything else, but on a larger scale. For example, you can make the argument that when oil is scarce, countries are more likely to go to war or fight over oil or start diversionary wars to distract from domestic issues. There's also good evidence saying that half of interstate wars are due to oil, so you can kind of use that evidence to quantify your link-in. Also, this argument is just super probable for a few reasons. First, because historical precedent is somewhat on your side because Russia has cut off oil before. The only issue here is that when Russia did cut off oil, it probably didn't trigger the impact scenario you were talking about, but still, you have some historical precedent. Also, cutting off oil is very intentional, so that's when compared to AF arguments that might rely on accidents or miscalculation to trigger their impacts. Accidents are just definitionally less probable than an intentional leak. Finally, this argument also links into the AF invasion argument because the AF argument usually says the Baltics need to be weak to invade. So if an oil shock does happen, that probably makes the Baltics really, really weak and nothing can really function because they literally don't have access to fuel. So that would probably trigger the AF's link into a quick and easy victory because the Baltics are just such a mess at the moment that it's probably a perfect time to invade. So the last argument that I chose for the neg is the new START argument. So this argument's kind of just the reverse of the AFs about allied prolif. It says that deploying troops would provoke Russia and then cause them to violate the new nuclear START treaty and begin a nuclear arms race between Russia and the US. So there's also an arms race impact without the new START link that has a lot of the same weighing here. And the impact is obviously usually miscalculating to war, proxy wars, social spending trade-off, just the same thing as kind of the AF allied prolif argument, but flipped to the neg. So on that note, we can start with weighing against the AF allied prolif argument. So the main difference here is that their argument is about allied states newly proliferating, and our argument is about big superpowers modernizing their existing arsenals. So you can easily argue that a Russia-US arms race is worse because first, their weapons are more advanced. Second, they already have the technology to develop weapons, so the process is much faster. Third, they have more money, so weapons development is much faster. Fourth, they have bigger militaries in general, so once a war starts, the magnitude of the war is going to be greater. Fifth, it also links into our allies getting nuclear weapons, because you can argue that if Russia starts crazily modernizing, our allies probably feel insecure, and that would trigger their allied prolif scenario. Other than that though, most weighing is the same as allied prolif weighing. For example, the conflict hotspot weighing links into any invasion arguments in the AF as well. More specifically, against the Russian invasion argument, you can also argue that Russia developing nuclear weapons makes it really overconfident, which can lead up to an invasion regardless of a few more troops in the region. Because the AF argument about why they prevent an invasion is deterrence, but if Russia's improving their nuclear arsenal and kind of getting stronger and stronger militarily, that probably outweighs any sort of boost in defenses that the Baltics get from a few more troops in the region. So those are the 6 most stock arguments that I've heard on the Septober 2021 topic, what they generally are and how to weigh them. So this video was just a general overview of each argument, but I also compiled and wrote out verbatim different ways to weigh these arguments against every other stock argument. So you can click on the link in the description to gain access to it, as well as additional free prep in the future. Happy debating, let me know what you think, and thanks for watching.